Welcome everybody to this video. My name is Kinan Aldamman and I'm a doctoral researcher at Trinity College Dublin. I'm part of an EU-funded project called Context, which is an international collaborative program in psychotraumatology. You are very welcome to click the link on this video and read more about Context. This session is one of 12 sessions designed for educational purposes in different aspects around psychotrauma. I strongly encourage you to attend the other very interesting sessions. This video particularly explores the mental health of humanitarian volunteers in emergencies. By the end of this session, you will be able to understand first the psychosocial consequences of a crisis, what happens in emergency, and how that can affect the mental health of population. We will try to understand the complexity of such situations and how this is linked to psychological outcomes. Second, you will learn about the humanitarian work context and humanitarian workers' mental health outcomes due to their work. We are here mainly focusing on volunteers, humanitarian workers. Lastly, we will learn about interventions and procedures to enhance well-being among volunteers. We will see that using a lens of humanitarian organization, link that with the international standards. This include introducing the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines for mental health and psychosocial support in emergencies and the principle of psychological first aid, PFA. PFA is a widely used tool designed to address critical situation reactions and prevent developing trauma-related disorders. We will target these objectives through first a virtual case study. We created a virtual country where events, people's life, culture, problems, crises are formulated for this educational session. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Edonia, a country overlooking the Edonian Sea, somewhere in the world. The story we are talking about happened here. All events are similarly repeated through different countries. For that, we believe that Edonia is an excellent place to learn from. Some of the pictures used represent real humanitarian volunteers. We are using them to illustrate the case study. In the following slides, our virtual story will be backgrounded in yellow, as in this slide. And second, literature-informed background. That is, research findings support the story throughout different countries, as well as some international standards. We are aiming to provide as much as support we can to the story of Edonia, trying to explain the phenomenon to you. In the following slide, our real literature-informed story will be backgrounded in blue, as in this slide. So, blue background means literature or international standard-based information. And third, I hope you all had the opportunity to download and read the case study document. If not, I strongly encourage you to do, where the file contains all the information as well as the references. The case study was developed to match this session and to provide some reading questions to help you focusing along this document. So let's start with Edonia's story. In March 2015, a 7.2 strength earthquake hit the capital Edonia and the surroundings. And due to this earthquake, 10,000 persons were killed. About 40,000 persons were injured and in need for urgent medical care, and about 100,000 persons became homeless due to the earthquake. The situation was not better in the surrounding districts of Edonia. People experienced the massive loss of properties and livelihoods in addition to the injuries and to the death of beloved relatives. Survivors quickly moved toward large open fields where they felt safer than being in the city. Most basic services were inaccessible and the medical system collapsed. About 80% of ambulances were out of service. The humanitarian condition of survivors was considered critical with 4 of 10 Edonian states affected by the earthquake, as you can see highlighted in red. The 1 million people who survived the crisis put considerable pressure on the disaster relief organizations. This was not the whole story in Edonia. The Edonian conflict was started in 2009 with large demonstrations against the government, demanding for more quality distribution of wealth, to stop corruption, and to improve democratic practices. The government used excessive force against demonstrators, which triggered more aggressive reactions throughout the country. As a result, a total of 7 opposition armed groups controlled about 40% of the country, as you can see highlighted on the map. In this conflict, 70,000 persons were killed, and about 1.5 million have forced to move out from their homes into temporary shelters. Furthermore, 1.3 million children lost access to education and sustained health care. Many people lost their livelihoods, and unemployment rate increased from 25 to 40% during the conflict. Increasing social and economic hardship on individuals and their families resulted in a greater pressure and psychological difficulties. And even this was not the case. People didn't live in tents as in the picture. Shelters became very common, where people used small living spaces. Entire families shared single rooms. Kitchen and toilets were shared with strangers and neighborhood. And how does that affect? In shelters, for instance, going to the toilets was considered dangerous for women and young children, especially at night, when walking in the dark exposed them to an increased risk of harassment. People lost the sense of privacy at home, which led to a decrease in the level of autonomy and intimacy within families. Besides, people in the shelters depend on NGOs' aid for food and basic needs, which were often insufficient. So it was very hard for people to feel the family, to get protected and supported as it's supposed to be. On the other hand, those people who were not living in shelters moved to new communities, where they often felt they were treated like strangers. Edonia used to be a diverse country with multiple ethnic and religious groups. Many new residents withdrew socially, while also facing stigma and discrimination from the original residents. Individuals' social networks were weakened by the displacement, whereby many of their families and friends relocated to different areas both during the conflicts and after the earthquake. Let's talk about the mental health in Edonia. Generally, mental health care was poor, fragile, and underdeveloped, with a remarkable lack of services and a huge gap between needs and resources, where the lack of specialists, funds, and facilities was huge and massive in Edonia. Above that, people with mental health problems were regarded as a stigmatized group, considered crazy or punished, believing this was caused by their own actions. Now we'll move to the blue-grounded background to talk about the psychosocial consequences of crisis. When we talk about the psychosocial phenomenon of humanitarian emergencies, we mean the pre-emergency and the emergency-induced problems. Those problems are either psychological or social, where both sides complexly interact with each other. That means we can't talk about the effects of each part without considering the other aspects, and this is very essential to understand the impact of emergencies on the mental health. The Pre-emergency social problems include factors such as discrimination against minorities and poverty, and the psychological problems include mental health disorders and personality disorders, for instance. The emergency-induced social problems can be like family separation, the loss of social networks and social support, the gender-based violence, where the psychological ones are related to grief reaction, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. As we mentioned, these factors interact with each other and affect each other. We should put that in mind for the future ideas. We can't slip them on each other. And talking about the effect of crisis on mental health services. In emergencies, access to those who need these services is limited, with more significant demand, and this multiplies the effect of crisis and make it more and more complex. As we can see in the figure, the crisis violence will affect the economic developmental status of a country, as well as will induce mental health impairment. This will directly put higher demand on the services and limit the resources. Resulting from all that, and according to the World Health Organization, the prevalence of severe mental health disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, and severe depression increases about 1% in emergencies. Also, the prevalence of moderate ones like depression and anxiety increases from 10% before emergencies to 15 to 20% after emergencies. Whereas the general distress not due to disorders is highly prevalent in emergencies. Now, after learning about the psychosocial consequences of crisis, we will go and continue our story in Edonia. We will move to talk about the Edonian Red Cross, which was the largest humanitarian provider in Edonia, with 10 branches, one in each state, and headquarters in Edonia. Edonian Red Cross managed to work all around the country as a neutral organization. So, as we can see, it was working all over the Edonian land with the conflict-affected and earthquake-affected areas. The Edonian Red Cross volunteers were doing their best to support people. For instance, they prepared and managed shelters, distributed food, clothes, and kitchen kits, provided first aid and primary health care, helped to set up water and sanitation systems, and implemented psychosocial support activities for survivors of the conflict. However, and due to the earthquake, many of the Red Cross facilities were also damaged. Despite this challenge, they raised a response to maximum capacity. They started a critical disaster management plan, including recruiting new volunteers, setting up first aid points in shelters, as well as establishing new partnerships with international aid agencies to cover the emerging need of people. By that, around 7,000 volunteers were working in 10 different branches all over the Edonian land. So, how stressful was it to be a volunteer in Edonia? The Edonian Red Cross volunteers were often unemployed, unmarried, and recruited to work in their local communities. As youth, people in such conditions, frustration was a common phenomenon due to uncertain economic status. Volunteers were working in teams driven by the motive to help people. However, belonging to the different tribes and religious groups made talking about a collective team approach challenging with these diverse backgrounds. Furthermore, a heavy workload and the difficulties in dealing with people's behavior who were just waiting to receive aids put a lot of pressure on the volunteers.
Female represented 60% of the volunteers. However, and according to the Edonian culture of being under a masculine leadership, 95% of the volunteers, manager, and team leaders were male. This situation was an added stressor due to power problems. And after the earthquake, rapidly, a total of 30,000 new volunteers were recruited in the aftermath. Given the rapid process, there was no time to train all the new volunteers well before sending them to work. Instead, a decision was made to place the new volunteers under the supervision of the older ones as an urgent solution to address the lack of available human resources. This also meant that the new volunteers didn't receive all the required training for the job. In their work and while helping others, volunteers were also exposed to stressful situations like being exposed to wounded people and dead bodies, crossing the front line between different armed group control areas where shootings were still a regular event, listening to people's horrible stories, and facing anger and aggression when individuals didn't receive sufficient food ration. Moreover, and under the duty of helping others, volunteers often worked long shifts and often within multiple teams. Even some Edonian volunteers, many of them had been displaced themselves due to the emergency, would even sleep overnight in their workplace instead of returning home. Especially the new volunteers felt helpless and powerless while working. Many volunteers felt overwhelmed by the recent event. Many team leaders and managers were not prepared to lead the volunteers in these type of situations, which could lead to conflicts within teams or frustration among team members. So those were the stressors that Edonian volunteers faced. Now we will go back to the blue background and discuss the psychological problems among volunteers. Actually, in the light of the evidence, volunteers are exposed to three types of stressors. First, being an emergency itself, where they are part of the affected population by crisis events, and they face the same conditions as others in such situations. So the same factors we talked about it at the first part of this session. Second, the nature of humanitarian work involves being exposed directly or indirectly to different traumatic events. It also involves being asked to function under extreme stress and to deliver vital services rapidly to cover massive humanitarian needs. It also includes some organizational stressors within humanitarian agencies, like bad relationship with team and managers. And third, especially volunteers, not staff or expatriate humanitarian workers, which you can read about their stressors in the case study. The volunteers are under extra stressors. These are related to being not professionals and not trained on dealing with different challenges in humanitarian work. Also, the lack of job description and clarity of roles as volunteers. Also, volunteers usually are young people. The majority of them are not employed, so it is an extra stress in such conditions. And finally, the allocated resources for volunteers are much less than the resources for other humanitarian workers, and that is entirely not sufficient to respond to their needs. As we mentioned when talking about the psychosocial phenomenon in emergencies, these levels of stressors interact with each other and influence each other, and it's hard sometimes to split their impact. This is also important for the next part of our discussion, so just put it in mind. What are the outcomes? So, studies show that volunteers, humanitarian workers are under higher risk of adverse mental health outcomes compared to the general population. It's also demonstrated that volunteers are more vulnerable than paid staff, and the most frequent disorders are depression and anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And as an acknowledgement of the problem, the Interagency Standing Committee considers the provision of support to mitigate the possible psychosocial consequences of work in crisis situation as a moral obligation and responsibility of organizations exposing staff and volunteers to extremes. So the interagency provides guidelines for humanitarian agencies about how to address that problem as well. We will discuss them. So according to these guidelines, a humanitarian organization should consider first making policies and plans with specific budget for volunteer care, and second, preparing the volunteers for the context they work in, that will including their roles and responsibilities, security situations, stress psychoeducation. And third, encouraging a healthy working environment, including reasonable working hours as well as facilitating regular communication between volunteers and their community. And fourth, reducing the work-related stressors through regular meetings, facilitating team cohesion and addressing any team conflicts. And fifth, ensuring the psychosocial support of volunteers, including peer support, stress management, and referral if necessary. Sixth, providing support to volunteers who have experienced extreme events, especially traumatic ones, by making psychological first aid available to them and discussing the coping mechanism with that. Also providing culture-appropriate self-care materials, making referral when it needed, and ensuring a follow-up check after 3 months of the events. And finally, making after-mission or deployment support mechanisms available for volunteers even after they finish their work. So let's go back to Edonia Red Cross and see how they reflected these actions into their volunteer care program. So as a responsibility, the Edonian Red Cross started a program to support the volunteers. This program started first with a 4-day training for manager and team leaders on supportive skills and conflict resolution methods, which included understanding the crisis psychosocial consequences and the typical stress reaction, and monitoring skills of volunteers' well-being. But also it involves some organizing skills for regular supportive meetings and methods to encourage self-care and peer support practices within teams. The training provided understanding as well as tools for managers to do volunteer care. The second step of the program included the recruitment and training of peer support volunteers across each branch. These support volunteers were trained in problem-solving skills, in skills to provide the psychological first aid after critical situations, in general psychosocial support principles, and how to facilitate group sessions. After the training, volunteers were assigned to provide peer support sessions to their colleagues. Peer support sessions were designed as an open and safe environment for volunteers to share experiences and challenges and to support each other within their team. The peer support sessions and the supportive meetings alternated once a week to ensure that volunteers had access to the support. The third step in the program involved the development of materials which could be used to raise awareness about the importance of self-care. These materials, such as booklets and posters, explained the common reaction to stress and encouraged volunteers to prioritize self-care strategies for themselves. As you can see, we are presenting one of the similar posters which was prepared in a culture-appropriate way to be used. In parallel to that, recognition campaigns were organized at community level to demonstrate the gratitude and appreciation of communities toward volunteers. In addition, plenary workshops were regularly organized for volunteers at the branch level. Here, They could meet the other volunteers and senior management to discuss their related issue while sharing a meal, for instance. As part of this program, a new volunteers management policy had been developed. The policy determined a maximum of 25 working hours per week for volunteers and the obligation of providing clear job descriptions for all volunteers in different working fields. The policy also included a mandatory 2-hour workshop for volunteers about line management structure and the volunteer rights within organization when they start volunteering. The security regulations were updated and all volunteers received a comprehensive security briefing. Also, all volunteers had received training regarding their tasks, security, and the common stress reactions. Finally, the Red Cross places were upgraded to be more comfortable and supportive environments and provided with recreational materials like table tennis, library, safe space for the volunteers to rest and to share conversations. We will go back to the blue background now. We mentioned in this video the term psychosocial support more than once. The mental health and psychosocial support term represents any type of activities aimed to protect or to promote psychosocial well-being and or to prevent or to treat mental health disorder. Why we use this term? It is to reflect the fact we talked about before, the complexity of the phenomenon. Emergencies affect people in complex, non-linear ways. People often face a combination of primary stressors like being in danger, losing loved one, as well as secondary stressors like economic hardship and unemployment. In parallel, people in emergencies also suffer from the loss of traditional protective factors such as not having access to community or family support. Besides, mental health services, as we mentioned, collapse in emergencies. For all these reasons, addressing all this complexity should happen through a wider spectrum of activities, and that should not be limited to clinical treatment. This should be built on the core principle of, first, human rights, targeting all people affected by the crisis across gender, age groups, ethnicity, promoting equality and non-discrimination, and second, participation, where people of concern should be encouraged to play a role in designing and implementing these activities. And third, do no harm. Considering the sensitive nature of psychosocial topic, mental health and psychosocial support activities should take into account the local culture, ensuring coordination and sufficient information and best practices while minimizing any risk of harm. And fourth, building on the available resources and capacities of the targeted people. And 5, integrated support systems where interventions should be linked to wider programs and to existing community support mechanisms, health services and social services to avoid fragmented services. And finally, the multi-layered support corresponding to the different way which affect people's well-being in emergencies that we talked about before. We can see the pyramid corresponding slide which represent the multi-layered support and some example about that. And now we will move to talk a bit about the psychological first aid. As defined by the World Health Organization, the psychological first aid is a humane, supportive, and practical help to follow human beings suffering serious crisis events. It is recommended intervention to be used in humanitarian setting after critical incidents. As a humane help, PFA aims to facilitate social support by helping people to address their basic need, accessing their needs and concern, actively listening and comforting them, helping them to access information, services, and community, and to protect them from further harm. The core skill in PFA is listening, where supporters your empathic, non-judgmental attitude to react to the people's concerns. PFA is considered preferable in humanitarian emergencies because it can be used from non-specialists after training them, and because it takes into account the complexity of the phenomenon we talked about. Actually, if you are interested in reading more about psychosocial support and psychological first aid, I strongly encourage you to access the IFRC Reference Center for Psychosocial Support website, where you can find a lot of relevant, interesting resources. And now we will go back to Edonia just to talk a bit about the opportunities and challenges that the program allowed for volunteers. Actually, the opportunities were related to the acknowledgement of management of the problem and supporting the program. Also, resources that they have budget, they have human, and they put that in place to implement activities for the volunteers. As well as the Edonian Red Cross was supported from other Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and they provided all the needed expertise to develop the program. Whereas the challenges of this program was related to lack of mental health specialists and referral pathway. It was very hard in place to establish a clear pathway to refer volunteers who need some additional or further help. And the organizational barriers to roll out the program throughout the country, as we mentioned that Edonia was a widespread country with 10 branches, and it's not that easy in place to implement program throughout the earthquake and the conflict and do all this organizational work. And third, the stigma against mental health disorders in Edonia. As we mentioned, it played a role, even a challenge to the program. And finally, the overall contextual factors in Edonia, where people and volunteers were suffering from the situation. Over this session, we talked about mental health in humanitarian emergencies, the stressors and mental health outcomes among volunteers, and approaches to enhance well-being among volunteers in humanitarian contexts. I would strongly encourage you to read the linked case study document, where you can find more about Edonia. You will also find some questions and a chart guide you over the document. Also, you will find the references used to develop this material. Thank you very much for joining this video. Hope we provide an interesting and beneficial material for you. Again, I strongly encourage you to attend the other context sessions. For any question, please write to me on this email. You are invited to visit Context website to explore the research we are doing. Thank you very much.